So I'm really happy to be with you this afternoon. So I'm Aurélien Acquier. I'm a co-director of the Deloitte chair on circular economy with my colleague Valentina Carbon, who's here with us as well. Just before presenting this panel, I just would like to have a few minutes to introduce the topic of circular economy before we turn to the panel. I'm just curious to know, before we start, how familiar are you with this notion? So, I mean, in your MBA program, how many in the assistants here had a specific course on circular economy? Okay. Yeah, you do. So it says it all. I think it's important to frame a little bit the topic, to share a common understanding of what we're talking about before turning to the innovations that are going on in France with our companies on these kind of topics. So to introduce the notion of circular economy, I think we need to put that into historical perspective and think about where we come from and in which situation, in which context a business school were created and also MBA were created. And so this old model, or the model we come from, we call it the linear economy. And once upon a time, we lived in a world where it was possible to say this: so natural resources are infinite and inexhaustible, because without this property, we would not get them for free. As they cannot be multiplied, renewed, nor exhausted, they are not an issue for economics. So, in your opinion, who wrote that and in which period? You have an idea? Yeah? Well, actually, it was the birth of economics. This is a sentence from Jean-Baptiste Say. And you may have heard that Jean-Baptiste Say was actually one of the founders of the oldest business school in the world. Actually, he's a French economist who was one of the founders of ESCP Europe. But as history has moved, you'll see that now we are shifting the paradigm. And actually, it's really important to understand that, because it's part of the big problem that we're trying to tackle and that we're going to discuss this afternoon, this idea that economics was constructed outside of ecosystem, outside of nature. Right? And so, actually, the business school were created in the beginning of the 20th century. The MBA appeared also in the 20th century. And actually, it's really easy to understand that you thought about business for business, right? And no matter what about the interactions with nature, because nature was so big, so infinite, that it really didn't count, right? So, now this is about economics, but what about business models? And actually, in a linear perspective, the dominant business model that emerged out of this paradigm was the take, make, and dispose business model, meaning that in order to create economic value or to create products, you have first to source raw materials, right, and go into production, then distribute, then you have the use stage, and then you have the stage of waste. So this is called the cradle to the grave model, which dates back to the Industrial Revolution. What's the problem with this model? Is that, well, actually, you do as if raw materials and waste were completely out of the scope. You don't pay for them, by the way. The only cost that you will pay to access raw material or dispose them is the logistical cost to extract it, right? But it's considered as free in this model. Actually, this model was super powerful to stimulate growth, right? And to stimulate, well, economic growth and social progress, and yeah, to benefit from this model. But today we are really seeing on many issues the limits of this linear model. Let me take two examples. The first example I would like to share with you is a question of food. And question of food is raising plenty of questions, as we will see with the case of Danone. Here I just took the case of meat consumption. And by the way, it's also a way for me to illustrate what we do here at ESCP Europe. This is a slide from a final presentation from students who presented their work for ADEME, which is official regulatory agency in France for the question of economies in energy and environment. And we've been working with them in a partnership logic on our course on circular economy. And so the students were working on the meat consumption, and here you have the trend of the evolution of the meat consumption. Actually, today, progress, or the status, going to means adopting Western habits in terms of food, and that goes especially for meat. We know that meat consumption, we consume too much meat, it creates enormous health problems, but it creates also enormous environmental problems, because just when you look at the forecast, if the forecast we see go on like this, especially with China rise in meat consumption, we know that we won't be able to keep global warming below 2 degrees because of the methane emissions related to cattle breeding, etc., etc. So just this point, like meat consumption worldwide is going to bring us to the wall, right? Another really striking figure that you have to keep in mind when we talk about food is this figure from the FAO, which says that 30% of the food that is being produced, that is edible, is actually wasted, whether in the production stage, in the logistical stage, or in the consumption stage. So we have systems that are massively sub-optimized, where we consume a lot, but we waste also enormous amounts, which creates enormous pressures on our ecosystems, right? So this is one example. Another example that is quite both fascinating and frightening is the case of plastics. Plastics, so here is some statistics from Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which are using also scientist academic work on this. Actually, what they show is that we have multiplied by 20 the amount of plastic we use since the 60s. We are expecting the amount of plastic to rise by 40% by 2030 if we don't change the pattern. And it's really too easy to understand the problems raised by plastics. But here is a really beautiful infographic that is quite frightening. You may think like plastic, that's okay if we recycle. Actually, guess what? Only 14% of the total amount of plastic that we use worldwide is being collected. In the US, the figure is about 9%. In Europe and China, which are the best place in the world, it's 25 to 30%. But still, you see that like the best in class, 25 to 30%. That's just for collection. Once it's being collected, 4% of this is lost in the process. Then 8% of this is recycled, but downcycled, which means that like the properties of the recycled plastic are not as good as the virgin one, so you cannot use it for the same properties, right? And only 2% is what Ellen MacArthur calls closed-loop recycling, which means that you recycle and you have the same properties in the end. 2% of the total amount of plastic we use worldwide, right? So what's happening with the rest? Well, the rest goes to incineration for 14%. 40% landfill. Cool, isn't it? And, well, the most freaky part is what goes just into the nature. So the third of the plastic we use goes to leakage. So think about that the next time you buy a bottle of water. Just to complete a little bit this perspective from Ellen MacArthur, actually you have to know also that what was going to landfill was also partly exported, right? And the major importer in the world was China. In 2018, they said, stop. We don't want to continue to be the garbage of the world, so they banned all imports of waste. What happened then? Here is the situation in the US. So you have a New York Times article from a few weeks ago who explained like how major cities in the US are completely overloaded with plastic waste. And so what they do, they incinerate, right? What's a situation that is also very worrisome is Hong Kong, and actually we have executive MBA who are working on this case, how Hong Kong will be, is managing this huge problem at the level of Hong Kong of what do they do with the waste, since they were exporting like 98% of it before the ban, right? So it creates enormous pressure, maybe you would say, okay, that's good because it will be a positive incentive for recycling. But then another complexity to have in mind when we talk about this is the social problem. You know, if we have to invest to recycle better, who's going to pay for it? Is it the municipality, but does the municipality have the money to do it? Is it the citizens, but are citizens ready to do it? And in France, we had a case, I don't know if you talked already about the Gilets jaunes, because, well, that's not like the social class attending business school, maybe, but, I mean, that's a reality. This social contestation movement was related to the increase in cost of energetic resources, right? So don't forget as well that, like, just saying it will cost more and the market will solve everything, it may be more complex than that from a social point of view. So, given these limits of the linear economy perspective, the bet of the circular economy is to re-embed business in its environment. So, in its social environment and, of course, in its natural environment. So the big idea is to say that business must be thought as interacting with the environment, and we must invent models that will, we must invent business model and practices that will create economic value without destroying the ecosystem, without putting too much of a pressure on the ecosystem, and even regenerating the ecosystem, right? So shifting the paradigm to be able to decouple growth from the use of finite resources. So if you remember the first slide I showed you on the linear economy, here the idea is to close the loop, right? And to say that any biological material that is being used for consumable goods, for example, should be digested by nature and returned and recycled by nature, right? And every technical product should be digested by the technical system, meaning that the waste you're producing when you're producing a smartphone like this, well, at the end of the life of the product, it should be the input for a new product, right? It's not only about recycling. That's also something very important. Recycling, obviously, is a very important problem, but it's also about business model that will favor a longer life of the product, a better use of the resources. Like all initiatives to move from product to service are really important when we talk about circular economy. So keep in mind that it's broader than simply recycling stuff, right? Although recycling can be very challenging and are obviously a very important element as well. Just to finish with this presentation, keep in mind that it's not for tomorrow, because I think the discussion you're having here is to say, well, this is going to be the next century challenge. I'm firmly convinced that it is going to be the next challenge for our society, but it's today, right? Keep in mind that this was in Paris, right? So it was 3 years ago. So the Paris Climate Agreement, where you had like completely different government, but people were very proud to say, yeah, we're going to keep below 2 degrees, and even we'll do the 1.5 degrees. We'll contain climate warming under 1.5 degrees. Actually, just look at this graph. What the graph shows is this is the scientific hypothesis that is backing this good scenario, right? To remain below 1.5 degrees of global warming, we have to be in that line, meaning that we have to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040. Useless to say that it's a big challenge, right? I think most people expect it to happen between 2040 and 2060, but just keep the idea that the level of the challenge we're confronted with is really huge, right? Of course, it's a process that involves regulation, politicians, etc., but without innovation, without business leadership, we won't go anywhere. And so what we wanted to do today is bring innovative businesses to the table and have different scopes. So going from the startup to the large group. So our panelists today, first, Eric Soubeyran. So Eric is the Vice President in Nature and Water Cycle at Danone. So thank you very much for being with us, and we'll use your presence at the maximum because you'll have to leave us at about 3. we also have Jérémy Boaziz from Grand Reservoir. You were part of the creation of this startup. You'll explain us what Grand Reservoir means. And you're the director of innovation. And we lastly have Jean-Denis Kurt, head of recycling and circular economy from Group Renault. So what I would like to do first is just give you the mic so that you can present yourself, explain where you come from, how you came to work on circular economy issues, and then we'll join the scene and start the Q&A, right? And before I leave the mic, just one point to facilitate the questions. You can use Slido. I guess most of you know it. So you just have to log to this website, so www.slide.do. And the code of the event is #516. And then you can use this interface to raise the questions. We'll broadcast them on the screen if it's possible. Otherwise, I have my cell phone. I'll see the questions, the votes that you make for the questions, and I'll be able to raise them. Yes? There is no such event right now? Let me check. And meanwhile, I'm giving the mic to Eric. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Aurélien. Well, good afternoon. So it's the introduction part. So my name is Eric. Shall I stay here or I climb already? So I stay here. It's better, I think. So I'm Eric Soubero. I'm the Group Vice President for Danone on sustainability. We call it nature and water cycle. I have a financial background. Nobody is perfect. So I started my career in merger and acquisitions. And then I moved to startups world in India, where I spent 7.5 years of my life, where I was in the medical device sector, and that's where I met a person that now has become our CEO, Emmanuel Faber, who I would say caught me with what we call in Danone the dual project, which is economic and social, and he proposed me to launch a new type of business in India, a base of pyramid business, to address nutritional needs of, at that time, children in India and in Bangladesh, where we have developed a new concept of businesses with the Grameen Bank and the Nobel Peace Prize Muhammad Yunus. So this has been an important part of my life. And then I went back to Europe. And in Europe, I was in charge of the milk supply for the company, because at that time, the vision of the group was that they should not need a purchaser to manage milk, which I think was the right way to look at it, because milk is first and foremost, I would say, a very sociological purchase. And I was in charge of that right in the middle of the milk crisis. And at that time, I would say, to go back to our topic of today, I think I realized very quickly that a few things that I've learned in schools like yours were completely not accurate anymore. I think, first of all, I was convinced that the price signal given by the market was wrong, because it was not including externalities. And that this was leading to a huge problem in Europe that we were facing just in front of our factories, where I had farmers protesting and breaking the wall of the factories that I had to deal with. The problem with that, we were completely caught into a transactional discussion about milk prices, while what the society and what our consumers were asking us were non-transactional questions, like, is milk good for health? Are cows grown in the right manner? Do they eat well? Are they well treated? The problem is you cannot manage that if the only solution that you have in your hands is to negotiate a price that you don't negotiate, in fact, because it's dictated by consumers that are global consumers now. And what I was explaining to many of the politicians is that the problem we were having in France at that time was that the milk price was not decided in Normandy. It was decided by consumers in Japan or in China. And that was a so-called liberalization of the market. So I think this was really for me a very intense period. I spent 4.5 years on this topic, and at that time with Emmanuel, with the board, we decided to shift our strategy in purchasing of milk, which represents 30% of our raw material, to a new price mechanism that we called cost plus, to agree basically the cost of production and to negotiate a margin with the farmers to stabilize. And I think this is very important, because when we think about circularity, this is why I started really the process. Is first of all, circularity is a solution, but it's more importantly a way to look at the economic, the way to look at the world. Indians look at their life in a cycle manner. I think, unfortunately, in this type of spaces, I have been taught that world is linear. That you're raised, you die, and you need to grow in your career. You need to develop yourself. When you think about all these words that we are using, they are fundamentally linear. And I think the economic system has been built around that. We want to earn more, we want growth, we want earnings per share, we want to work for shareholders. And at the end of the day, the question is where this is leading us. And I think this is leading us to what you described just in your introduction, which is the monde that is exhausting resources. So I don't want to be too long, but you asked me to illustrate, so this is what I'm doing. And this is why, as a finance person and as a business person, having built businesses, I accepted 2 years ago, upon Emmanuel's request, to take this new role in Danone of VP Nature and Water Cycle. Which for me was not easy because, of course, it's a very transversal, very politically exposed general secretary. I learned many things, and because my mission is very simple: is to bring this topic with all the contradiction that a large company like Danone has, and we have tons of contradictions. Bring that into our business. And to transform basically the way we operate on many things. And I think this is the point I'm going to illustrate later, but I don't want to be too long. So this is about me.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Jérémy, you want to tell us a little bit? You can be shorter if you want.
Okay. I'll try to. Hi everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be with you. So my name is Jérémy Boisiz, and to tell you a couple of words about what I did, I graduated from a business school 10 years ago, HEC, and when I was there in school, I think like many of you, I was like very attracted to like discovering the world and traveling. So I took 2 gap years and explored 25 countries around different projects. And then after school, it was the big boom around startups. So I did my own startup, and smartphone apps were coming. So I did an iPhone app. And after this first business, I got into influencers marketing to join another startups, and eventually I created this third one. I joined the founders, and so what we do is we create new age urban venues that gather like large communities around experiences like food, culture, sport. So this kind of like very large hybrid venues that you often see in former industrial buildings and that gather a lot of people. That's what we create. And so we're in the... yes, I would love to. So this is the kind of place we create. So it's very like it's often very industrial look and feel, and you have like great food, and you have like great cultural events, concerts, parties, and this bring life and community into the fabric of the city. So we work with very we work with like real estate developers on the largest scale of urban development project. So, for example, this is like the biggest urban development in Greater Paris today. We're gonna build alongside with Bouygues like 350 square meter, so 1,000 square meters. So it's very large scale, and we create that kind of venues inside this project so as to like the developers don't just bring like buildings and concrete, but they also bring like ecosystem and life and cultural dynamism. So that's what we do.
Thank you. And as you will explain, you've been also working a lot on eco districts, and so also sustainability and ecological aspects are also part of this. Jean-Denis, thank you for being with us. So, Jean-Denis, you're head of recycling and circular economy at Groupe Renault. Can you tell a few words?
Thank you very much, Aurélien. So, yes, I have I mean, it's a bit contradictory, but it's a more linear career than the two other panelists here, since I've been working at Renault since 2000 in the area of environmental protection within the company. I started in 2000. I was hired by Renault to work to support the environmental certification of the plant of, at that time, the first plant of Renault in Brazil. Which was quite an interesting experience. And then I've been working in different areas of, say, environmental protection in the manufacturing sector of Renault. Especially, I've been in charge of the environmental and energy and safety part of the new plant project in Chennai in India, where we inaugurated the first zero effluent discharge plant of the Renault-Nissan Alliance. It was back in 2010, and actually it's already kind of circular economy, because the water, basically you don't have any outlet of effluent. The water is just 100% recycled except what is evaporated. So it was actually a very fascinating project and experience. And then I joined the environmental strategy in 2014, when I could get more insight on the product or the product aspects, since I had been working more on the production aspects until then. And since 2 years back, I've been in charge of circular economy and recycling, which is quite a fascinating job at Renault, because Renault has been very active and quite a pioneer in this area. Well, I will have the opportunity to tell more about that, but basically Renault with Nissan and Mitsubishi is the major automobile alliance worldwide, and it's well, there are huge stakes in terms of raw materials consumption and environmental impacts, recycling, pollution, etc. In the automotive industry. And well, I'll have the opportunity to tell more at the panel.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's go. Okay, so to start with, I think, there was a mistake in the ID of the event. Actually, you should add an E after here. So that's why it wasn't working, I think. Well, so to start with, I just would like to know, so you already presented part of it, but according to you, can you explain in a few words, what the biggest issues in your industry is today? What are the biggest social and environmental issue, mostly maybe environmental if we talk about circular economy, and just present maybe an innovation that you're proud of and that you try to set up to address these kind of issues. So, Eric? Yeah, or as you want. We have plenty of mics.
Okay. I think the major issue that the food industry has today is that it has commoditized food. Since humans are human beings, they run after protein. And the problem is, right now, we made something that is vital for humanity a commodity. To the extent that we are believing that we can waste 30% of it. And this is really the major issue of the food system right now, and this has created a lot of difficulties on both sides of the chain, because on the upstream parts, we have removed value added from the agriculture. So we have a lot of agriculture people that are not able to earn a decent living from what they're doing. And on the bottom part of it, we are wasting a lot of money with a lot of problem either of malnutrition or obesity or diabetes. And if I had to put it in short, this is really the major problem. The major problem of the food industry is to rebalance that, which means rethinking of the supply chain. Circularity is one of the tools that we have to activate, but is to rebalance that. And I would go even one step further, is our firm conviction in Danone, and this is difficult, is that as a large food company, we have been part of the problem, and we are still. And our CEO is acknowledging that in front of the board and our investors. So one of the largest innovations that we are currently implementing in the company is, first, there is a governance changes that is very important for us, which as Danone has declared and is working on becoming the largest B Corp in the world. I don't know if you're familiar about what B Corp is, but it's about using basically the business as a force for good. So the logic behind is just to say fundamentally, why are we here? What is the purpose of the company, and how you can use the strengths of your businesses to have a positive impact. Rather than playing karate, you want to play the judo. You want to transform the system and use basically your supply chain to do something. So this is basically why we have entered into this journey about being a B Corp, which is a huge complexity. And we started not from, let's say, so-called the easiest place. We started, for instance, in the US, where our subsidiary there, which represents 6 billion euros of turnover, has been certified B Corp last year. So what does that mean concretely? It's more than a certification, but I can give you a very clear example that I don't know if I should be proud of it, but I think that is really transformational for us. Is when we were discussing about our supply chain in the US, there is something that is very clear, is that if you think that we've made food a commodity, agriculture has been over-specialized and over-intensified since the Green Revolution. This is another problem. We believe that we could remove organic matter from the soils and compensate that with chemicals, and that this can go on and on and on. But what we see now is that there is basically a marginal decrease of productivity, and that the soils are depleting and exhausting.
May I add that there is also a question of economic sustainability for the farmers themselves?
Sure. Sure, because the system by itself, the people who are basically suffering the most of this commoditization are the farmer, because the value added of the supply chain has been moved. So that's one point. But I'll come back to that. But I don't want to be too long. So if you ask me an example, so the example that we took and that we were very proud of 2.5 years ago is we took a declaration that was one of my first work when I took this job, was to say that in the US we would remove 50% of all our products out of GMO. And now actually we reached this level, and we will move, I hope, more than that. Why? Not because GMO are bad per se, but because GMO is a trigger of specialization of agriculture. So as soon as you say, I'm going to build a supply chain up to the feed that the cows are eating without GMO, you need to enter into discussions that are fundamentally different with your supply chain. You need to discuss with them, what is your crop rotation? How do you use your soil? Do you have roots that goes deep in the soil? What's the carbon matter that you're having? Do you use pesticide? What type of pesticides? So basically, you bring basically this debate on the table. And I've been extremely proud of this. I don't know if it's an innovation, but for us it was an innovation because it was clearly embedding what we meant about being a force for good, using your supply chain to transform a system. And we are just on commitment, and we found a lot of solutions. The first year when we budgeted this transformation, and when we were in front of the board, the first assumption we had was that it would cost our US subsidiary something between $50 to $80 million, which is huge. Now we are in a place where we have been able to bring this additional cost to $10 million. So why? First, because the teams have been doing a tremendous job, but also because by using the force of nature, you're able to have something that is profitable. And that's very important, because this has been really one of the milestones that we have of transformation, and to some extent is very much linked to circularity, because agriculture, by definition, the way you operate it is circular or not circular. If you remove all your carbon matter from the soil because you are tilling the soil every year, you're not circular. You're removing life from the soil. So you're not circular, you're linear, and you're adding back nitrogen. If you leave your carbon matter, you have the circularity coming back. So this is an example of how to design a circular food system can work, and can work for the farmers and for a company like Danone.
And yeah, okay, I think everyone here in the room understand that the model that you're describing here is more circular than the classic large farming one you describe. But then, I mean, the switch, is it so easy to do it? Because it seems like you say, well, it pays off. Well, is it as easy as that? Because if the market is already there, I mean, how comes this practice is not generalized in your sector?
If it would be easy, everybody would do it. Well, I'm not sure, actually, because, you know, there is a lot. I was saying that milk is sociology. Most of the farmers in the world are more than 50-year-old. So if you think that, if you go to people and say, or if I go to ESCP, for instance, and I say to all the nice students that are in this room or in many things, forget about Michael Porter and the 5 forces. Forget about SWOT. Forget about prices, because the price signal doesn't work. Forget about all the linear algorithms that are built by very, very intelligent people in the finance market that don't even know what are the consequences of the linear system that they are building. What's the answer? So if you go to farmers that have been trained, groomed, and that have made their life and their career, which a lot of success, by the way, for the world, because we should never forget that these people have brought the world out of famine. There is almost no famine anymore in the world. So it's very easy to say now that we are polluting the planet, we are, etc., etc. But these people, in 30 years, have made a world free of famine. And now they're not even paid for it. So, so this is basically where I think there is something that is very clear for me, there is a sociological aspect, so you need to bring the transformation through people, and this is tough. Because, and again, I don't want to be too long, I think this is bringing a level of granularity of contact points that many corporations don't have anymore. The whole economies of scale rationalization principles that we have learned, I think are completely absurd in the world that we are living now. Mm. I think we need to think of these economies of scales and disaggregation. The Kanban principle has developed a food system that is extremely weak right now. If we cannot supply Paris for 3 days, there is no food anymore in your store. So this could create a systemic problem. So this is for me where the difficulty is really, because when you talk about agriculture, and I don't know about other industry, so I'm just talking about what I'm saying, fundamentally at the end you talk about farmers and people that you need to engage into a transformation. And this is taking time, and this is tough. And this is taking resources, because you need Danoners on the field to be in contact with these people and make the transformation. So this is where the difficulty is.
Okay, and just to finish on that point, you mentioned the fact that Danone is on the process of becoming a B Corp, a benefit corporation. So can you explain also what it takes to become it? Is it possible for a publicly traded company to be one? And also you mentioned contradictions. And here you're saying, well, it requires a lot of investment in time, in brain energy as well. How do you manage the inevitable contradictions that you will find with short-term results and like market constraints, financial market constraints? I mean.
Yeah, so I think first, what is a B Corp? So I don't know if you're aware. Who is aware of what is a B Corp is? If you raise hands, so that I can gauge how far I need to explain. So okay, good. So basically, it's a movement that started in the US, interestingly. That basically says, and I say interestingly because you could imagine that with the sociology of Europe, this type of ideas should have come up in Europe, right? But they have not, which I think, by the way, is a big question of how conservative the European thinking is. But that's another topic. So it started in the US. So in the US, you can list your companies in two lists. A list, where your purpose is to make profit. And this is your only purpose, right? And you can list your company in some states that are now quite numerous, actually. It started in Vermont, where you can be a B-listed company. That means that your purpose is not only profit, but it's also social good. And by the way, you have an advisory board that can veto some decision of the shareholders if they believe that is not moving in the right direction. So there is really a check mechanism. So to your point, is it applicable to a listed company headquartered in France? Unfortunately, no. And I say unfortunately. This is why we are part with Michelin and a few other companies in France to try to adapt the code of commerce in France to get that provision. Because I fundamentally believe that the job of executive in Danone is not to deliver value for shareholders, is to deliver value for Danone and for the consumers. And then after, the shareholders will benefit from it. And I'm not saying, and this is the vision that we're having. So how do we manage the contradiction, which is your other question? And the contradictions are daily. I mean, my job, and this is what is tiring, is managing contradiction. Because of course, we need to have results. We need to have profits. We have shareholders. We can be taken over tomorrow because Danone has no shareholder of reference. So our performance is our best guarantee, first of all. If we don't perform well, it's very risky for the independence of the company. That's the first thing. The second point is I think you need to be relevant. And the relevancy that we have is, and this is something I'm asking to my teams, and very often we have a process internally to do that in our strat plan process, is you need to know what problems your company is relevant to try to solve, right? And you need to, on the other side of the spectrum, to be able to articulate with what you're good at, right? And this can become your purpose. So there are areas, for instance, carbon-free logistics. I don't believe that Danone can have a worldwide impact on this topic. It should not be our purpose. Agriculture, yes, I believe Danone has something to say because it's relevant for us.
Actually, there is a question that was raised by participants precisely about this question of agriculture in France, saying, yeah, France has a very strong farmer community and lobbies the EU quite heavily. Having talked about rising meat consumption, how can you get them on board?
Well, I think I mean, first, not all farmers are meat farmers, huh? But
you have a huge impact, sure, because you're also using dairy.
Yep, I think it's all a question. Of course, it's all a question of balance. If you look at the statistic that you show there, of course, there is a problem of red meat consumption. It's clear. We eat too much red meat. We should make a distinction between the different type of meat, first of all, because they don't have all the impact. I mean, it's not the place to go into detail, but it's something we are studying very carefully. Then there is the problem of what's the role of husbandry, animal husbandry, in an agriculture system. And from there, you can decide what type of protein you can have, right? So how do you reconcile? I think a farmer, and we are lucky in France or in Europe to have diversification of farmers. The farmers don't usually have only meat production. They produce meat, they produce cereals, they produce legumes. They have what we call polyculture, right? And I think this is a system. An extensive polyculture husbandry mechanism is fully compatible with the Paris Climate Agreement. There is a very recent study from IDRI, which is a very interesting think tank, or the Uppsala University in Sweden, that shows that nourishing 350 million Europeans with a consumption that is the current consumption of dairy and adjusting the intake of meat is fully compatible with Paris Agreement, provided that you are in an extensive polycultural system. So to do that, the problem I face, and we face, and I faced when I was in charge of milk, is how do you discuss that with your milk farmers, which is a little bit your question. So you have to find ways and spaces where you have discussions that are not only transactional. And this is very important. And this is why we have tried to stabilize the prices with the cost-plus mechanism, for instance.
Just before you leave, because we understood you had a constraint, I just want to take the opportunity also to raise a few more questions from people here. So one question that is coming a lot is about plastics. You're obviously using a lot of packaging in your product, and so a big question is, what are the alternatives to plastic for a global consumer product company such as Danone? Are there any viable alternatives? Would reusing be the best solution?
Yeah, I'm sure my colleague from Renault also must be working on this a lot, but by definition, FMCG's companies, in a way, is the industry of plastic, because what you have on shelf is very much plastic. So it's clear we are part of this issue. This is why we have been one of the founder of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and we are working a lot with them. So I think there are three levels of questions on plastics. One is to make sure that you disconnect the packaging industry from using more fossil plastics. So it is basically closing the loop that you were showing before. This is one aspect. Finding other materials than the materials that we are currently using, and get rid of the ones that are not recycled. This is one. There is a second point that is, I think, very important, is what other type of packaging you could imagine that are refillable or reusable. And I think here there is a fantastic opportunity to create new businesses. I see that really as one area where startups or new businesses have an incredible perspective. So that's for me the two elements that we can activate. Is really about these two elements when it comes to plastic. So as far as Danone is concerned, we have committed by 2025 that all our packaging will be recyclable, compostable, or refillable. So we have a massive transformation in front of us, and that we are actionating to reach this goal.
Thank you very much. Jean-Denis, so Renault is also a major user of plastics, right?
Sure.
Different kind of plastics, but still it's plastic. It's
Many
part
kinds.
of the many raw materials that you're using. Can you explain us, how this issue is impacting Renault today and what you're doing about it?
Sure. But if you don't mind, I'd like to start just with a small reminder of the great challenges of our industry in terms of raw materials, basically. No, it's not this one.
It's after.
Yes. So first of all, obviously the automotive industry. Raw materials are a major stake for the automotive industry. I mean, you need a huge amounts of raw materials to produce millions and millions of vehicles every year. And within the raw material stakes, there are 3 or 4 major ones. One of them is the availability of raw materials. Well, you've probably heard about the Earth Overshoot Day, which is the day when we've used all the resources that the planet can provide in 1 year. And this day fell on the 1st of August in 2018. And following the current trends, it will fall at the middle of the year, at the end of June by 2030, meaning that we would then need 2 planets to maintain our standards of living over the long run. And a good example is copper. Well, our industry, our society needs a lot of copper, always more copper for electronics, etc. An electric vehicle requires 4 times more copper than a combustion engine vehicle, but the known reserves are only of 37 years.
And when you say it's 37 years, does it integrate the hypothesis that the electric vehicle would scale up?
I'm not even sure. I think it's based on the current consumption. So this is just tomorrow. So this is a good example of the stakes of availability of raw materials. The second one is purely financial. This is on the top, it's a long-term trend of commodity index, basically rising with huge ups and downs, which have a very strong impact on an automotive company. And as you can see on the bottom, in the last 2 years, for instance, the rise of the raw material prices impacted the operating margin of the group by more than 300 million, actually nearly 400 million euros yearly, 1 year compared to the previous one. So compared to 2016, that's almost 800 million. That's a huge part of the benefit of the company that is basically, erased by the rising of the raw material prices. And the third one is usage efficiency. Honestly, it's not very in our interest to say that, but we have to admit that the business model consisting of selling private vehicle to every individual consumer is absolutely not the best the best use we can make of our resources. Basically, an individual car is parked 92% of the time in average, and basically it's used only 5% of the time driving, and during this 5% of the time, a car that has an average 5 seats has 1.5 people. So 1 people, 1 ear, 1 arm, and
it depends if there is dead people in the
car. It's terrible
for
the second half of, Anyway, and the other thing is that 50% of public space nowadays is dedicated to cars in most cities. We don't even realize that because we got used to it. But actually there is a growing awareness about that and less and less acceptance, which is normal. And we need to do something about that. So first of all, I'll start with the first two, the answers provided by Renault to the first 2 stakes regarding actually the availability and the use of raw materials. And later on, I hope I'll have the opportunity to talk about the third one. So this is the linear business model you introduced at the beginning. And this is an example. Actually, so Renault has been a pioneer of the circular economy. We've been, along with Danone, we contributed to, we are a founding member of the Helen MacArthur Foundation. And actually, at the same time, Renault created a circular economy ecosystem. So back in 2008. And actually, this first example is much older. It dates back to the 40s. It's remanufacturing. It consists of taking old engine or gearboxes from the after-sales network, basically out of service mechanical parts, and dismantling them, selecting the good parts, and cleaning them and reassembling them jointly with a certain proportion of new parts to make an as-new engine or gearbox, which will be sold to the client at a reduced cost, 40% cheaper in average than the new engine or gearbox, with the same guarantee, the same performance, etc. So it's very resource-efficient way of maintaining a car, and this is the extent of the available mechanical parts you can find of a vehicle, on a Renault vehicle. And environmental impacts in this kind of repair parts are reduced by 70 to 90% compared to the new part. Then Renault has invested into Indra. So Renault took 50% of Indra, which is the largest network of end-of-life vehicle dismantling centers in France, 350 dismantling centers, dismantling almost 400,000 cars per year, and providing some end-of-life, actually second-life parts taken from end-of-life vehicles that are distributed in the after-sales network of Renault to the clients, once again to repair the cars at a cheaper cost and with almost zero environmental impact. And then there's a third subsidiary called Gaia, which was created specifically for circular economy businesses and particularly material closed-loop recycling. And this is an example, for instance, how the bumpers are collected in the 350 dismantling centers of Indra. And then they are collected, they are shredded, cleaned, recycled into new parts that will be put on new vehicles. And that's it for now.
Okay. Eric, I know you have to leave. Thank you so much for being with us. And yeah, now it's time also to discover what's happening in the construction industry as well. We mentioned the evolution of cities, especially around transportation, and the fact that most cars are parked, not used, etc. It creates a lot of change in the way municipalities manage cars today in Europe. I guess your environment is also changing in urbanization projects and building projects. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What are the big issues in your sector?
Yes, I think we're at the crossroad of two big change, like a change in urban development and the way we create new areas in cities, and also change in retail. I mean, like big malls where families spend the afternoon buying stuff, like it's dying. Like nobody wants to go in malls anymore, and people want to spend more time having interesting experiences that change themselves and that connect them more with community than buying stuff. So we are at the crossroad of these two tendencies, and I'm going to try to tell you a bit more about these two. So on the urban development stage, there was a huge change in the way cities are made in France. It started like 5 years ago, and I think it started because public authorities had to outsource like a range of services that they were bringing to community, and so like they organized 5 years ago this big call for proposals called Réinventer Paris, that brought on the market like very interesting piece of land in Paris, and calling to real estate promoter to bring answer. But like in the past, the answer was basically building buildings, like bring concrete and buying the land in the more expensive, the most expensive you could give, and the biggest chance you had to get the tender. But this time the city asked for societal answers, and answers that involve community, that involve ecosystem, that involve startups, that involve of course a concern for environment. And so it's a huge change. Now real estate promoter, they just don't bring an answer in terms of urbanism, but it's urbanism combined with an ecosystem that brings progress for society, for environment. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. one of the main concern of cities in these new answers for building new areas is, of course, sustainable development. So, for example, unfortunately, we lost the biggest urban development in Paris recently. The one who won brought in his answer the construction of a wooden structured made tower, and like it was the main argument that made them win the competition, is that building this tower was imprisoning as much carbon as the whole Bois de Boulogne, the whole like wood of Boulogne in Paris in 1 year, because like building with wood instead of like producing carbon, it imprisons carbon, because like wood is nourished out of carbon. So when you build with wood, basically you capture carbon. So that's one example. Another example is the most in Paris, the most maybe broadcasted answer to this competition, Réinventer Paris, is a project called 1000 arbres, so 1,000 trees. Basically, it's a building that's conceived as a matrix for trees, and that 1,000 trees is planted on the building. Another example we work on this time is the second largest urban development in Greater Paris is about an eco area, so an area that's oriented toward being carbon neutral, that involve like an urban farm to produce like short circuit way of
for food, you mean?
For food, exactly. So all that is oriented toward like more environment concern, more community, and not necessarily just like building buildings and like selling them the most expensive.
And I guess that's where you're bringing your competitive advantage, isn't it? Because as a startup, I mean, large groups in the construction sector, why do they work with you on this? Do they have already the skills to develop this kind of projects, and what do you bring them?
Yes, I'm going to answer your question. Maybe just to finish my last one figure that's very interesting is during that competition, like 1 billion euro worth asset were put on the market during this call for proposal, and what sum up this reality that it's not only about like the biggest amount of value of money that a real estate promoter can bring, but also like the social, the environmental value that this new project bring, is that this land was sold 40% below its value, because the answers were not optimizing the economic value, but like we're taking more into account like the common good, like the sustainability, like community. That's one thing. And to answer your question, yeah.
But maybe we'll return on that question on partnerships, because also you mentioned during the debates we mentioned also the issue of recycling. You mentioned also the practices of Renault in France that you have developed. And well, this morning we were in a panel, in another panel on circular economy, and we were lucky enough to have someone from UNEP, the UN Program for the Environment. And what they explained us is like about the quantity of materials that we're developing today. If you compare the amount of cement that has been used in the US for the 20th century, you have the same amount of level of cement, or the same amount of cement is being used today in 5 years in China. And so there is this idea also that all the things that we're discussing here are very important in a European context, of course, but also they are becoming tremendously important in countries like China. And I was just wondering this about the initiative that you presented of disassembling cars, recycling them, etc. Do you have the same kind of initiatives today in countries such as China, or in other parts of the world, or is it a completely different context? So how do you manage the international dimension behind these kind of practices?
Sure. Let me see. Yeah, it works. Yes. Yes, actually, as you saw, this say ecosystem is based on specific subsidiaries that we created in France. So this format is actually being developed only in France and Europe. However, it is among our priorities to find and use more and more recycled plastics in the vehicles we make in other overseas countries such as China, India, South America, and which is not always easy because basically it is a new concern. Basically, we've been recently, some of my colleagues have been in China to search for recycled plastics. They've been to plastic suppliers, asking if they could provide recycled plastic. It was the first time any car manufacturer was asking them the question. So, and there is a cultural thing that in some countries, the notion of recycled product or reused, etc., was like had a negative image of second-hand, and this is evolving. But still, it may still exist, or at least the business part of the business thinks it's still the way the consumers think, and then they are still afraid of using recycled materials, or at least claiming they do so.
Just to draw another parallel between your two experiences, so we talked about the evolution in city environment in Europe. What are your projects in terms of the development of the idea of smart cities and the fact that maybe transportation will be completely different in the urban environment in 20 years than it is today? What kind of projects do you develop today at Renault?
So yes, this is actually the answer to the third stake that I mentioned about the poor level of resource efficiency of the individual car business model. Actually, we need to develop every type of shared mobility, including car sharing, and also, actually, this is one of the initiatives that Renault is developing. There is a specific division created, Renault Mobility, that has launched a business very recently in Paris, following the collapse of the Automotive system, for those who know, a car sharing system that has unfortunately collapsed for, say, economic reasons. And then Renault has set up its own offer of shared vehicles, not only electric vehicles, but among other ones, electric vehicles that you can use. They are self-service. You can use them with your smartphone, and for only 1 hour. It's very simple. It's cheap, a handful of euros. So, and then we need to develop this kind of new mobility services. Instead, that's to say, selling mobility instead of selling cars. And one ultimate aspect of that could be what we call robo-taxi. So everyone is working on the autonomous vehicle, and that will bring someday the robo-taxi, which actually soon enough, which is a taxi without driver, a driverless taxi. So you may say it's just a taxi without driver. Yeah, yes, but actually the difference is that, taxi, at least in Europe, for instance, is quite wealthy people, and it's not for everyday trips. So basically, you will go to work every day with your car, or maybe transport, but many people go with their car. And these people will not take the taxi because it's too expensive. But they might take a robo-taxi because it would be very cheap and it would be very efficient. It will be turning and always running with people inside. And yes, basically, so this refers to the waste hierarchy that you mentioned in the introduction. This is our version of the waste hierarchy, and this including recycling, reuse, etc. And actually, this is what we consider as the ultimate level of the waste hierarchy. That is basically avoid to produce part of the products, may produce a smaller number of products, use less resources, and use them more efficiently.
Okay, thank you. I guess we can also give the mic in the room if there are questions that were raised but that I didn't select already. Yeah. So other questions? Yeah.
Hi, this is Evan from London Business School. One of the questions that I have is, how do you often make the financial case to companies to make a shift over to a greener business model? Because in a lot of cases, I mean, a lot of companies are making, they'll make objective initiatives that look good on paper, but they don't actually change the core business model because it's too expensive to actually change operations and make the long-term 15, 20-year investments. How have you seen your companies being able to convince companies that maybe the more intangible benefits will actually outweigh the significant cash investment that you need to make up front?
That's a very good question, and it's a difficult one, because obviously you don't change the business model of such a large multinational cap company in overnight or even in 10 years. So actually the way we are doing it at Renault is by creating specific subsidiaries, divisions that have a certain level of independence for their decisions. Actually, they cannot afford to lose a lot of money, but still they don't have to meet the same criteria of a profit as the rest of the company. And this is what we did for these circular recycling subsidiaries, etc. This is the same for Renault Mobility. Everyone is aware that these car sharing and new mobility business is not necessarily profitable in the short run, but it is necessary. It's a question of survival, probably, of the industry in the long run. So everyone has to work on it. Except that, so unfortunately, most of the companies still working on traditional business rules and profit rules, but then we create subsidiaries like that can work somehow like startups within the company, and that have more flexibility and more flexible criteria.
It's a bit as well what Renault did when it comes to electric vehicles, right?
Yes, except that the people that developed the project, they had to make the figures match with the profitability criteria of the company. So they invented some crazy figures, actually, about the number of vehicles that we would be selling in the short term, which proved completely wrong. But actually, without that, I think they could not launch the project. But actually, that worked because the CEO was actually convinced that this was the thing to do.
Yeah. What is clear is that this topic has to be managed as innovation projects. I think you wanted to react on this.
I think it's a very interesting question because it's the core of it. I mean, like, economy has been oriented toward profitability, and now we're bringing new criteria. We in our industry, it's the core break we're facing, because we say to a real estate promoter, okay guys, you're gonna sell us a piece of your program half the price, because like what we're gonna do inside is half as profitable as, for example, if you sell it to a supermarket or if you sell it to H&M, but it's gonna bring more value. Like what you lose on a very small part of the program, on the 2% of the program, is gonna bring more value to the whole program. So like our whole mission today is to prove this model, is to prove that if you lose value on a small piece, you can like gain value like on the whole level.
And it's very interesting because the difficulty then is to quantify these intangible benefits, because sometimes you cannot say how much this will bring value to the car, to the real estate project, etc. So it's very difficult to quantify, and sometimes you have to invent new tools to evaluate and incorporate these kind of externalities or parallel additional benefits into the business decisions.
We have different questions, so please, yeah.
Yeah, so my first question was exactly that, relating to finances, but my second question is about culture. So there's certain things that you can't really... Oh, I'm Vanessa from the Rotman School of Management, sorry. The second thing that goes hand in hand is, how do you change culture, which in companies like as big as Renault or as a startup, where you're not only changing within your internal company, but your stakeholders, your entire supply chain, so that the importance of what is going on and of the circular economy goes beyond things you can't really quantify in a spreadsheet.
Just one point about that, which actually the two questions I think are related. I think you have to distinguish two types of organization, which are like big multinational companies are trying to adapt, and I think the case of Danone is a good case of a company trying to change also its culture. It's a very long process. There are plenty of contradictions in there, but most of the time you have to optimize existing practices before moving to revolutionary practices. And on the other hand, it has to be viewed as an innovation space where you will have companies that are born circular, are going to develop an entirely new culture devoted to circular economy and completely different business model. One example that we've been working with both on research and also in our educational programs is Phoenix. It's a startup in France that was created to fight against food waste, and actually they are doing very, very good to spot a real like triple benefit model where they decrease the food waste while making a profit that they share with supermarkets they're working with, and also they are giving free access to non-profits to give the food that is not wasted to charities. And but they are a very specific company. They were created with that intent, and so their whole culture as well is focused on that objective. It's I think one important part of the debate, and so maybe it also echoes the fact that your a new startup maybe makes it easier to grasp these new types of value.
I mean, like, so if I understand well the question, it's about like changing the culture of an industry, right? To orient it toward the
I think it's changing the culture of an organization in an industry that is not circular yet.
Okay, so we're in a setup where like it's very particular. Like, I mean, the industry didn't like take the decision to change, but in order to like get the piece of land they're gonna build on, in order to get it from the city, they need to bring like more interesting answer, more social answers. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't use the
Just put it like this.
So like it's an industry where like, yeah, I shouldn't shout. Sorry, I can't control this, you know. Like I've always shouted. Like, maybe I'm gonna not use the. No, you have to.
Actually, you have to, because it's being
I'll
recorded.
try, but I'm sure I won't succeed. So basically, it's the public authority that say to the industry, okay, you're gonna change what you do because otherwise we won't give you the land. So that's why they're like working with people like us, because like we bring a new vision of this. We're like part from the industry, but part from outside the industry. I come from digital industry. We have a philosopher in our team. Like we are marketing experts. So like we help the industry to change. They don't have the choice. They need to work with us if they want to win. They need to bring like more social answers and more environmental answers if they want to win their like tender. So it's a very interesting case. And also what's interesting in our case, like I think we have a specific position on this urban development market because we are both very creative. We can like bring new answers and like create new answers in urban development, but we are also we also speak the language of real estate. We're business people. We have real estate experts. We are raising an investment fund, so we can like do what we're talking about, and so these are two interesting criteria in change. The first is like there's an outside force that forces the industry to change, and we can change things from within because we are part outsiders, but also part insider, and know how this like industry work.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? So my name is Giannis, and I'm from Simon Business School. And I wanted to first make a comment and then a question. My comment was in regards to colleagues from London Business School. They asked about how do you convince companies to go into this idea. And I also want to kind of push back on the idea of that when you're focusing on ESG and social governance, that you're sacrificing profits to push these agendas. So because I actually worked for a socially responsible investment firm trying to convince pension programs to invest in these ideas. And what we found is actually when we did backtested the data, when we were able to quantify these factors and make it relevant to industries, you actually outperform other companies who are not performing well in this industry. So you're not really sacrificing profits, you're actually gaining profits by being able to do this. And I think that narrative needs to completely change, because if that doesn't, you alienate a large portion of the investment population. And I think the benefit to the companies is in a form of lowered cost of capital. And so that's how you would convince them, is if you adapt this, for all of these large CapEx programs that you're doing, your cost of capital declines significantly. And so which also then contributes to your profitability. And so you need to, I think changing that narrative is something that's really essential and that we have to be careful around. In terms of my question is about emerging markets. You quoted in terms of China's use of concrete and how much it lapses over the United States. And is how do you incentivize these countries that are coming up who need these resources, who have to develop these infrastructures to start utilizing these different forms of technology to develop it, rather than copying what the Western world did during the Industrial Revolution?
I think it's a key question and a key comment as well. First, may I react, or do you want to just from my point of view? What you say is very true. It's this question of circular economy have not only to be framed as threats, but as business opportunities. It's really super important to be able to spot the innovations and show how it contributes to the strategic advantage. That's really how to make it work and impactful among companies. Then about your second question, it raises the question of how you combine innovation with public regulation as well. And here I think maybe China is like a good setting still, because when I think people who know China will agree that when people understand the importance of an issue, they are ready to go. It can be much faster, for example, to take decisions that will be applied at a very large scale than we would have in Europe, for example, where the political complexity of decision making is much higher, and so the innovation path can be much faster also in these countries. So there again, maybe it's a good setting also to introduce more radical changes.
If I may bring some more elements, I think the question of asking like how do you incentive organizations or state to like go more sustainable, it's the key question, because we are human after all, like if we have the choice between two solutions, one that is cheap and efficient and the other that is less but more sustainable, like it's very, we're like we have our brain is wired in a certain way. So I think the answer and the key is to provide sustainable services that are more efficient and more appealing to the market. And in our case, like what we want to prove is two things. The first thing is, okay, real estate promoters, if you give us this part for cheap, in the end, you'll be able to sell your property and apartments more expensive, because we're going to create a dynamics, we're going to bring culture, we're going to bring sense in what you do, and in the end the value is higher. Another perspective on it is we're the other trend we work on is the future of retail. I think we believe that kind of alternative venues where you go spend time and around culture with people and food is the future of malls. And what we want to prove is that model is going to be more effective than the old model. The same way that we work with co-working is able to provide owner with higher rents because their model is more effective. They've proven that if you bring community and office as a service, in the end it's more value. We want to prove that if we create this kind of spaces and involve brand, not with selling their product, but with like communicating the experience of their brand and providing the public, the audience with experiences, we can provide a more efficient model than normal retail. That experiential retail is going to be like co-working, like above the standards of the market. So in the end, you have to be able to prove that you create more value, you provide a more efficient service or a nicer service.
Hi, my name is Angela, and I'm representing the Washington University in St. Louis Olin Business School. Very long name there. So it's been very interesting to see, the different efforts that have been taken to sort of move away from the linear economy that we have now to create a more circular economy. I'm interested in your thoughts, however. What do you think the unforeseen downsides are of a more fully implemented circular economy? In other words, were we to progress down this road and be, let's say, 80-90% towards more of a circular economy than a linear economy, what will we then look around and say, wow, we didn't think of these problems as existing. What are the next problems that we'll be solving once we move towards a circular economy model?
Jean-Denis? No, I'm just kidding. Who wants to?
No, I'm not sure to exactly understand the question. If you could reword.
Like Renault, for example, is doing these closed loops things, but that's only a part of your operations. It's not 100% of your operations. Let's say we are very successful and you're able to put, let's say, 90% of the material back into production. You've discovered new mobility solutions, you've moved the business to somewhere completely, and you're able to look at Renault and say, our business operations are now fully circular, right? Everything feeds back into itself. We have a closed loop. And that's what your goal is today. When you reach that goal, or when you're close to reaching that goal, what do you think the new problems are that you're going to discover and want to solve?
I understand, thank you. I think we're trying to have a holistic view. And actually, I showed a small part of our environmental plan, which, actually, when I said, obviously, raw materials are one of the major stakes of the automotive industry. The other ones are obviously global warming, air pollution, and then social issues, etc. Many issues, and we're trying to address all of them. Maybe too slowly, but at least we are trying. And actually, when we say, circular economy is very wide. As I said, it can include recycling, but also some ways of providing services instead of products, etc., changing the business model. So actually, we are trying to progress on all these aspects simultaneously, in parallel. Anyway, we don't have the choice because in terms of CO2 and air pollution, anyway, the legislation is very strict, always stricter. And then it's not always the case for circular economy, but we're trying to do it in addition and then to progress in all these things in parallel. But obviously, we cannot solve all the issues alone. I mean, the car, because we are a car maker, is only one of the mobility solutions that we can use. So it has its place, but obviously it's a question of how to integrate all these mobility solutions in the most optimal way in terms of services and efficiency. To provide mobility to the people, but at the same time with the least the smallest negative impacts? I hope this answers at least partly the question.
I may try to complement. A big discussion, I think, is the idea that since circular economy is, for example, if you take the agricultural debate, the idea is that we should move to move production closer to consumption. And so there is all this debate also of is circular economy going in parallel with the retreat of international trade and international collaboration to some extent, you know. So maybe there is this aspect that could be like you go back more at the national, regional level, and so this could be a kind of unexpected outcome of this. Then I think that in terms of outcomes, there are two possibilities. Maybe major companies that are well installed on the market today may be not banned, but may face difficulties if they cannot complete the shift towards service-driven business models, etc. And the shift is quite complicated because inside the company, like if you have a marketing team or a selling team that is like selling goods, moving from goods to services is a huge organizational shift. It's extremely complex. And then there may be competitive transformation that are very strong there. But last, I will say, if we don't take radical action to shift the way we use raw materials, what we will see in the future is new types of concentration of value in the value chain. I think what we'll see is a return of supply-driven value chains, where actually suppliers of raw materials will have much, much more power than they have today. What you have seen is like over the last 20 years, 30 years, like this idea of externalizing productive activities and like continuing to manage the client interaction, because that's where the value is. I think what we may see in the next decade is a huge shift back to raw material access. And that may not be funny for everyone, I think.
And I forgot to mention that, yes, when we are establishing our sustainability plans, etc., we may forget some issues, but many NGOs are watching us on every possible issue, and they are reminding us when we forget an issue. And we've been reminding, for instance, a couple of years ago, that the way the cobalt is, which is an essential component of the electric vehicle batteries, the way the cobalt is extracted from the earth is not always very, very clean or socially exemplar. So yes, we've been requested to demonstrate that there's no child labor or slavery, etc., in the cobalt that we're using, which is actually, honestly, 2 years ago we were just, it had not been investigated very seriously. But since then, it's not finalized, but it is being investigated very seriously. And it's always, yes, when you forget something, you can trust that someone will remind you.
We're reaching the end, but there is a last theme that I would like to cover with you. And the you is both you, but also a collective you with people here. I was just thinking, like the MBA was created like 100 years ago, yeah, or a little bit more actually, and well, it has become the mainstream degree in business administration worldwide. It has experienced like a huge internationalization all over the world. And well, I think this question of circular economy raised big questions for us educators in MBA programs. And I would like to have your opinion about like how should we rethink, what should be changed in MBA executive education in order to fully address these topics at the level of complexity that they imply. Do you have an idea about that, or?
I think it's a like big point, you know, like today the rules of the game are being like just like changed, and we just know that we need to change, but it's like a blank page. So like how do you train leaders to answer like this new challenge that we have no answers? So like maybe the answer is like instead of learning specific skills or like specific rules, like our friend was talking about the five forces of Porter or the SWOT. Like maybe the way is like just like to learn how to learn new things. You know, like get back to the basics, like philosophy, like how philosophy, ethics, moral, like how do you think with yourself and not use like all the recipes, and I think it's a challenge for MBA, because like MBA is an institution, so like it's like the place where you learn how to do business, but the fact is like we have to change the way we do business, so like it's a crucial point. And maybe one last thing, like when I entered business school, like I was raised in a world of like new economy and profit, and like and I was graduated in 2009, so like, you know, I grew up in a world, and in 2009 the world I grew up in, like it didn't exist anymore, so like it's very interesting and it's a challenge.
Yes, if I may add that, yeah, my suggestion would be, maybe it's the case, but to integrate the idea that innovation is no longer a technical matter only, a matter of engineers, and it's a question of business model innovation, creating new business models. And yes, this is really actually maybe the most difficult part, because the engineers, if you make you ask anything, they will develop whatever you're asking for, but then you need to have the right idea, the idea that will really make the difference, and that's to say maybe a new business, completely new business than the one that the company has been doing so far. And this is something that, well, is not only a question of personal creativity. Maybe it can be taught somewhere, somewhat, and maybe some new tools can be taught as well as, I mean, beyond just financial or profit payback, etc. Tools.
So maybe we would have to think about reframing the Master of Business Administration with a new name, which could be the Master of Business Design and Creation, or I don't know. But maybe the problem is to see that as administration instead of design, maybe, yeah?
I'd like to get some answers from the students about this question. Do you have some ideas? Yes, one at the end.
I do. I disagree with the change. I think administration, we need to learn.
Wait, the microphone.
I disagree. I think that what we need to know are financial models that actually support what is supposed to be and what we should be doing in the circular economy. So blended finance and concepts that are starting to be used by institutions like the IFC and the IDB, where you're actually creating financial models that make these things happen, is what I think we should use. And there are many use cases that we could be taught in a pilot type class within MBAs in parallel with circular economy courses. Because at the end, we're still MBAs, we still like numbers, we still like business. We just have to reformat how we consider financing these type of enterprises.
Thank you. My name is Miguel Ferreira. I have been consulting with private equity funds on how to integrate sustainability into their portfolios for around 5 years now. And I completely agree with you. The one thing that I would like to include in the curriculum is how to measure the sustainability impact that we are creating in businesses. I know that here in Europe, you guys are very advanced in reporting and using metrics to analyze the impact. In the United States, the SASB, which is a Sustainability Accounting Standard Board, which depends, works with FASB, which tries to help improve GAAP accounting rules, is developing rules to put financial information into the balance sheet that is linked to sustainability. And that is something that we're not learning in business school. And it's very important to look at the numbers to understand sustainability.
something.
I think the idea was not to say that you should scrap all the courses in finance and marketing, etc. That was not the idea. But of course, I think there is a big need to reframe also the existing tools to introduce this kind of consideration. Yeah.
Hi, James, the Schulich School of Business. I think you're right about the reframing, and I 100% agree with my colleagues behind me about looking at finance differently, specifically looking at something like the strategy tools that we use differently, specifically Porter's value chain. I know it's something that probably a lot of us have learned. But when you think about the value chain, it is a very transactional tool. It starts with raw materials and moves its way all the way to like after service. If you think about even just adding another layer before margin or even after margin and the way that that tool exists, that you could think about like recycling. Because it's the responsibility of the business is within its value chain. If you increase the size of the value chain to understand what it needs to happen from a waste perspective, that's an easy way to adapt that tool. So as we're learning how to understand transaction and we're learning about how to where and find margins and where to create value within the system, if we understand that at the end it doesn't disappear, that there is either a loop back or just another part of the arrow, is an easy way to adapt kind of one of the many tools that we use, but from a strategy perspective specifically.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. The concept of, global value creation footprint or something like that, like you have the global footprint over the life cycle. You could consider the life cycle of a product, of a business, of whatever material, but over considering how to preserve the more value all along the life cycle and the business.
I'm really happy to hear that.